Thank you very much, Maeve. Thank you for this very warm welcome. Very nice to be back again. So, Hobbes, I'm going to talk about again this evening, is a philosopher who's usually associated with the scientific movements of the 17th century. And nor is that mistaken. He knew Galileo, whom he described as the greatest thinker of his or any age. He debated with Descartes. He was part of the Circle of Mersenne in Paris. And he devoted much of his work to mathematics and physics. However, Hobbes was born in the era of the High Renaissance, 1588, and that meant that when he went to the University of Oxford, the training he received was a humanist training, as they would have said. That's to say, he studied the Studia Humanitatis. And what I want to argue this evening is that he never loses his identity as a Renaissance thinker. And nowhere, I want to say, is that identity clearer than in the abiding interest that he has between texts and images. And that is to say, in the visual representation of philosophy. That, in a way, dates him. I mean, you can't imagine Locke or Leibniz being interested in the visual representation of the concepts that they discussed. But for Hobbes, this is absolutely fundamental. And it is a kind of intellectual shift from a Renaissance to a scientific revolution perspective. So let me talk about that Renaissance perspective. I want to introduce you to Hobbes as a humanist philosopher. So where I need to start is with his university training. I mean, biography may not be a great subject, but education is always vital if you're going to understand any philosopher. And Hobbes attended University of Oxford. There were only, of course, 2 universities in England at the time, and went at the very tender age of 14 in 1604 and followed the humanist curriculum. The humanist curriculum had been introduced to replace the scholastic curriculum, which of course was too much associated with the Roman Catholic Church, and had been in force in Oxford since the 1560s. Now, by the humanist curriculum, they mean something specific. The Studia Humanitatis was held to have 5 elements. The first was called grammar, but that meant the study of Latin grammar, and that was never taught at university. It's a modern idea that you should teach the classical languages at university. Why was that? Well, you went to something called a grammar school before you went to university, and at the grammar school you learned grammar. That is to say, Latin grammar. So when you went to university, the first thing that happened to you at Oxford or Cambridge, and the first day you went there, and I've done quite a lot of research on this in the case of Cambridge, is that you had a day of examination in Latin. You were taken around the college, in which you were only allowed to speak Latin. No one was allowed to speak any other language within the precincts of the college. And so you were questioned in Latin, and you were meant to be able to converse in the subject. And I found quite a number of students who went up one day, came back the next, because they were not able to manage that first of the 5 elements in the Studia Humanitatis. The second element is rhetoric. Now, rhetoric went together with poetry. In rhetoric classes, what you studied was Aristotle, the art of rhetoric, and in translation. Now, you didn't study it in Greek. You studied it in Latin, and you studied also Cicero, the De Oratore, but above all, Quintilian's great summary of the classical art of rhetoric in the Institutio Oratoria, a work of around 100 Common Era. Then, under the heading of poetry, you studied Homer, the greatest of the poets, but you also studied Horace, and the great Renaissance favourite, as we know, of course, from Shakespeare, who uses him all the time, Ovid. And the idea here is to learn the theory and the practice of eloquent speech. Rhetoric is the theory of eloquent speech. Poetry is its practice. You then proceeded to 2 final elements in the so-called humanistic studies, and they are history and moral philosophy. Now, those 2 subjects are taught together because the point of studying history was to be thought to find good examples of moral and immoral behaviour. So that, of course, explains a great deal about early modern historiography. These were exemplar, as they said, exemplar of the virtues and the vices. And in the famous phrase of Dionysius Halicarnassus, history is philosophy, teaching by examples. But then you went from the examples to the philosophy itself. Now, this entire curriculum has one aim. It is to teach you to write, and especially to speak in public, in the most eloquent possible style. And that made these universities eminently practical sites of learning. Because within Renaissance Europe, the universities were the training grounds for lawyers, legislators, and above all, of course, the clergy. I estimate that at the exact time at which I'm speaking, certainly the University of Cambridge, I haven't done the research for Oxford, 90% of all graduates went into the church. So these were seminaries. Now, if you think of that profession in a Protestant country, being a clergyman, or if you think of law, or if you think of politics, what have they in common? A capacity to speak in public. So that is of paramount importance, and the universities teach it. But there's also an intellectual reason for this focus, which is based on the idea, which is fundamental to Roman antiquity, that there are two types of academic discipline. The famous typology is in Cicero's De Oratore, and the distinction is as follows. In some subjects, proof is possible. That's, and the paradigm is mathematics. And in the other case, proof is not possible because there are always two sides to the question. So you have what they call an argumentum in utramque partem. You can always argue one side or the other. But in that case, there's going to be no apodictic proof, ex hypothesi, because there's always going to be another side to the question. And so what is being offered in these disciplines is not proof, it is reasoned persuasion. Now, reasoned persuasion is the province of what Cicero calls, he already calls, the human sciences, scientiae humanae. And the human sciences, most obviously the law, which is the queen of the human sciences in this period, where the entire setup, of course, of law courts then, but also now, assumes that there are two sides to the question. There's a case for the prosecution, there's a case for the defense. They appear on either side of the court, and they're going to debate the two sides to the question. There's a case for the prosecution, there's a case for the defense. That's, of course, also the case in some legislative assemblies. How is it in Ireland? In the United Kingdom, our legislative assembly still has two sides. I mean, we have more than two parties, but the idea was, of course, there are reason going to be two parties because there are just two sides to the question. So you face each other and you debate the two sides to the question. So the geography, the topography of courts and legislative assemblies presumes this classical humanist view. All right, if we're talking in moral philosophy or in the law or in any of the human sciences, we're going to have to offer reasoned persuasion, which means present an argument. There are two sides to the question, and we have these visual metaphors. You say, I'm trying to get you on my side, okay? So there are two sides to the question. I'm trying to bring you round to my side. Now that's what rhetoric offered to teach, how to get people on your side. Don't think of rhetoric as the figures and tropes of speech. That was of no great interest to these people. They didn't teach that. What they taught was what they called inventio, the invention, meaning, of course, the discovery of persuasive arguments. It's not just persuasion. These people aren't just sort of crazies who want you to throw your arms around. They're not evangelicals. They want it to be a persuasive way of laying out an argument. That's what invention is. Now, if you look at the classical textbooks, here I radically paraphrase them, but I think you can see that there are three steps in the classical argument here. First is, you can't ever win an argument in the moral sciences by purely logical means. So they love to cite Aristotle here, you must add pathos to logos. You have to learn, that is, how to arouse the emotions of an audience, because that's going to move their passions. And if you move their passions, that's the way to shift them round to your point of view. So notice the Latin verb is, of course, movere. That is a deep play on words. I'm trying to move you round to my side of the case. Move you to my side. How do I move you to my side? Well, I move you by moving you so deeply that you move. And actually, this is how we still talk about very eloquent speakers, don't we? We have physical metaphors for this. We say, I was transported. I was carried away. Yeah, to that side of the case. All right, how do you rouse the emotions of an audience? That has to be the question in the moral sciences. Step 2. Quintilian says, I quote him, this, I'm obviously translating, The answer is going to sound odd, but what you must attempt to do is to get your audience to see what you're trying to argue. Turn auditors into spectators. To persuade, you must make them see things in the oculus mentis, the mind's eye. It's Quintilian's phrase. We use that phrase. You've got to try and make them see something in their mind's eye. So notice seeing and understanding are taken to be synonymous. What it is to understand is to see. As we say, now I see. All right, how do you do that? That brings us to step 3. And here they are interested in the figures of speech. Once you've laid out the argument in the correct persuasive mode, which I could talk about if you wanted, then you do add figures of speech. Because this is called, that's why we call it imagery, of course. These are images, trying to get someone to see something. And the idea is the very simple one, that will be more memorable and therefore more emotionally arousing as well. More emotionally arousing and therefore more memorable. And I mean, it's not a complicated thought at all. It's simply the thought in one of their examples that you don't say of someone, he's untrustworthy. That's just describing them. What you say is, he's a snake in the grass. Now you have a picture. And you think, oh, wow, I'm going to avoid that person. He's the snake in the grass. It's a picture in place of a description. And that, allegedly, makes it more memorable. So there's the first thought, imagery. Second thought is not classical, but is very powerful Renaissance thought, and takes us into the heart of Renaissance visual culture, which is that you shouldn't just add figures of speech to your text, you should add actual figures. That's to say, pictures, illustrations. And notice that nowadays still, when we publish books which have got illustrations, what are they called? They're called figures. Figure 1, figure 2. Turn to page 20, you'll see figure 6. These are not figures of speech, these are actual figures. Now that gives rise to 2 very important developments. And one is something which is very well known to Renaissance students of Renaissance philosophy, which is the importance of a genre of emblem books of which there are thousands. I don't mean thousands of copies, I mean thousands of editions of emblem books. It's the great bestseller of the first age of the printed book, are emblemata. And these are works of religious and moral edification, the pattern being set by humanist jurist Andrea Alciato with the book called Emblemata, 1531, and then editions every year since then. I mean, probably literally every year since then. And the moral message is set out in rhymed verse, which of course is the most rhetorically potent thing you can do, and because it's the most memorable. And the moral of the story, which is set out in the rhymed verse, is presented as a picture on the opposite side of the page. Because pictures, as the phrase went in the Renaissance, are worth 1,000 words. A picture is worth 1,000 words. Now, these woodcuts are pretty crude to start with because there's a technological problem here, which is how you insert illustrations into books. And the only way they could do it, they're block printing, of course, is by putting in woodcuts. And you can't do much with your continual reprinting of a woodcut. But there's a huge technical innovation towards the end of the 16th century, which is the capacity to insert copper engravings into books. And that transforms the visual look of books. The earliest examples are Alciato's Emblemata begins to have engravings from about 1550 onwards. But the other great Iconologia, work of iconography, is by Cesare Ripa, first published in 1611. And then the first English case, Geoffrey Whitney, A Choice of Emblems, 1585, a very important book for literary scholars because Shakespeare clearly had a copy of it, and many of the pictures are converted back by Shakespeare into figures of speech. So the adulator who plays the pipe, as though Hamlet says to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, "You think you will play upon me?" It's just a picture that he's remembering. Now, the second development, late 16th century. Of course, once you can do copper engravings, you can have really grand frontispieces to books. This is a completely novel idea. And what is a frontispiece? At first, of course, they're just woodcuts. But once you move from the woodcut to the copper engraving, then what they are is summaries of the arguments of the book. You open the book and you're shown the argument. And you're meant to think, that looks interesting. But you're also going to remember that that is the argument as you read. And these people are very skilled at reading as seeing. So there's the frontispiece, and you are internalizing the major propositions of the book as you look at it. And the idea is that's going to be a mnemonic device for you as you read the book. It's going to help you to understand the book because you've already got its basic ideas in mind. Now, the edition of frontispieces is not general. This is very expensive insertion of copper engravings. So it's mainly confined to works of obvious pedagogical intent. And it's not therefore surprising to find that one of the major uses of what came to be called the comely frontispiece in late Renaissance, 17th century works is in the great genres of the studia humanitatis: poetry, history, moral philosophy. And it's not surprising, therefore, that it's in the translations of these texts, trying to popularize classical culture, which is a great feature, of course, of the late Renaissance, turning it into the vernacular. That it's in translations of classical texts that these frontispieces come to be very prominent. Let me say a word about them. So let's take the three genres and start with poetry. You begin to find frontispieces added to translations of classical poetry. Now, as I've said, the favourite poet in the Renaissance, I mean Shakespeare's favourite classical poet, for example, is Ovid. And so if you begin with Ovid, we're going to get some fairly simple decorative woodcuts. So here, for example, is the frontispiece of the first translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses, 1565. But suppose you move on a generation. Wow, that's not a woodcut, that is a very elaborate copper engraving. The moral is perhaps a little bit optimistic for Ovid, because what you see on the left is amor, but the left is not the dominating side, always the right is the dominating side. So sapientia dominates amore, and if wisdom can dominate love, you will get virtue. And virtue is in her triumphal car, and she goes up into heaven. That's not actually how I read Ovid, but there is a way that you could be introduced to him. All right, the greatest of the poets, no one ever doubted this, the greatest of the poets is Homer. And so here is the frontispiece to Homer's Iliad. This is the famous translation of Chapman, the subject, of course, of John Keats's famous sonnet on first looking into Chapman's Homer. So here, a bold attempt to show you, in summary, what the poem is about. There are two sides to the question, of course, because there is Greece and there is Troy. You see Achilles on the left and Hector on the right. You also see the presiding gods, Apollo, who sided with Troy, and Vulcan, who forged the armour of Achilles. So there's poetry. What about the other two genres, history and moral philosophy? Well, it's the same story. Here is moral philosophy, and this is the earliest translation of Aristotle's Ethics into English. Just Caryatids, 1553, very early woodcut. And much in this early phase is purely decorative. Here's the other. This is by far the most published work of moral philosophy of the Renaissance, of the whole early modern period. That's to say, the De Officiis of Cicero. Here's the first bilingual edition. Again, it's just a very simple woodcut. But what if you move on? Here is Thomas Lodge's translation of Seneca, and this is 1620. What a transformation. The move from the woodcut to the copper engraving, something of extreme complexity, and an attempt to summarize Senecan moral philosophy. So there upon the left, the sinister side, of course, is Nero, opposed by the figure of temperance, who tempers water with wine. That's always her iconography. And they stand by the title of the book. They stand by classical columns. But notice there are two sides to the question. There's tyranny, and there is the temperance of the Stoic. But of course the sad story is that the triumph of Stoicism over tyranny can only end in death. And there you see the death of Seneca. So there you have a plausible account, taking the two sides to the questions of what Seneca's Stoicism is about. Okay, finally history. Here we are back with the earlier tradition. This is the first ever translation of Sallust's two surviving histories, just caryatids, just a quite simple woodcut, purely decorative. But suppose we move on a generation here. Well, very beautiful engraving of the observations on Caesar. Notice two sides to the question, Caesar on the left, Pompey on the right, welcoming you into the book, which it's clear is going to be a book about warfare. Here is another fine case. Doesn't come out so well. Can you see it all right at the back? Yeah, so here's Livy's History of Rome, the first ever translation into English. This is just the section on the Punic Wars, but notice how he's giving a very strong account of how you should read that part of the history, because what we see here is justice on the left and prudence on the right, and the consequence of having two sides to the question, one is acting prudently but also acting justly, what will happen? Well, victory will happen. So the allegation is that against the barbarism of Hannibal, this is what Scipio was able to offer. And so there is the winged victory with the palm of glory in her right hand at the top. A rather optimistic, very Roman story. This is in fact how Livy does tell the story. Okay, here's a final thought about history. Nobody doubted in the High Renaissance, I suppose nobody has ever doubted that the greatest work of history from classical antiquity is Thucydides. I mean, some people like reading Herodotus. This is a mistake. As the wit said, Herodotus was indeed the father of history, if by that you mean that the serious subject began in the next generation. And here is what begins in the next generation, Thucydides. Now, Thucydides, of course, is fabled for his difficulty. The Greek is almost untranslatable. So one of the great feats of humanist scholarship of the Renaissance would be translating Thucydides' Greek, not just into Latin, which Lorenzo Valla managed to do, but directly into the vernacular. So who was it who scaled this Everest of classical scholarship and translated Thucydides directly from Greek into English? Well, the answer is Thomas Hobbes. That is his first work of philosophy. And that establishes a European reputation as a major philologist. And of course, philology, one of the great sciences of the time. Now, Hobbes produces this very expensively. He devotes 10 years of his life, as far as we can see, to producing it. And I notice in Dr. Minot's new and wonderful edition of the Peloponnesian War, he says he has read every translation of Thucydides into English, and that Hobbes's is still the one that he goes back to, and that he's used it quite a bit. It's an extremely exact, it's very Hobbesian, of course, but extremely exact translation as well. Now, of course, Hobbes wants it to have a frontispiece. And so here is the frontispiece that he commissions, very elaborate copper engraving. And what is he doing? He's giving you an account of how to think about this book. So there are two sides to the question. Here's Archidamus on the left, the king of Sparta, and here's Pericles on the right, the leader of the Athenians. You know from the base that it's a war that we're going to read about, and you can also see that it's conducted on land as well as by sea. You know who it's between, if you know any Greek. I mean, that it's between the Lacedaemonians and the Hellenes, and you know where it takes place. Hellas, it takes place in Greece. Moreover, and here is where Hobbes really cuts loose, you discover why Sparta won the war. If you can see it, this says hoi aristoi, and so here is, it's quite wrong, because in fact the Spartan constitution had two kings, as Hobbes perfectly well knew, but he just gives them one king, and then he gives a council sitting with the king there, deliberating calmly about what to do, and four of them have raised their hand with a finger going up, which Quentin tells us in his wonderful treatise on gestures, is the gesture of assent. So they're all assenting to a proposition which has been put to them by this person who's learning and reading the book. Now, Athens, hoi polloi, not a chance of winning a war. There's a great number of, there's the open palm of rhetoric. These people are haranguing them. These people are not listening at all. It's just a mass of people. How can they decide anything? So you learn why Sparta won. I mean, it's an extreme interpretation of the book, but it is what Hobbes wants you to understand about Thucydides. Notice, if I might add, it's a wonderful image, isn't it? That Hobbes has by this stage also internalized a number of conventions in frontispieces about the importance of books. Books are precious things. Books are fragile. And so they need protectors. They need supporters. And so it's very common in Renaissance frontispieces to see figures standing by columns, pillars. Columns, I mean, pillars of strength. They are going to support the title. We saw this here. They stand next to columns, and they're on either side of the title. We saw it again here. Again, the columns, and again, they're armed, and they're next to the title. Here, they're actually upholding the title. They're protecting the title of the book, and again here. So back to Hobbes, and notice he's done it again. There are two sides to the question, but at the same time, these armed figures stand by. And of course, the metaphor is already there in early modern English. To stand by means to support. They are standing by the title. Lots of visual puns. They're standing by the title, as if to protect it. They're upholding the title in the other case. The other convention is that, of course, a frontispiece is a liminal space. It draws you into the book. I mean, this is very clear in the Ovid case, if I go back, where the whole geometry of the frontispiece, the perspective, the vanishing lines, draw you into the title. Or in the case of Caesar, the vanishing lines and the perspective draws you into the battle. You're drawn into the theme of the book. So they're liminal spaces, and behind you is the book. So they're an invitation. And as we can say, again, here it is in Hobbes. These are perspectival spaces which stand next to the title, and the title is brought out towards us. Now, I said at the start of this talk that Hobbes liked to present himself, and he's usually presented in the critical literature, as someone who, as he boasts of his De Cive, that I have established moral and political theory on a scientific basis for the first time. But, I've been stressing, Hobbes was also a student of the humanities, and what I next want to argue is, without doubting that he saw both his great works of political philosophy, the De Cive and the Leviathan, as works of science. The De Cive, he said, had founded a science, political science, founded because it's axiomatic, it's not rhetorical. Nevertheless, he wants Renaissance aids, and he wants, that's to say, above all, the representation of his philosophical ideas. He never gives up the belief, which he announces in this frontispiece, that the visual is what makes your arguments memorable. And the main way of doing it is that when he comes to his two great works of political philosophy, they both have remarkable frontispieces, and I now want to talk about them. This is the frontispiece to De Cive. The first thing you'll say is, yes, but what makes us think that Hobbes approved of this? I mean, what makes us think this is Hobbes? Well, the answer is this. This is very interesting. This is a sketch that you will find, or at least that I found, in Chatsworth House, the Duke of Devonshire's mansion, where Hobbes, of course, had been tutor to his children over 2 generations. And this is the presentation manuscript of the De Cive, which Hobbes gave to the Earl of Devonshire in 1641, the year before it is printed. And that is the title page. That is the engraved title page. Now, the crucial thing to notice is that those two are identical. Now, Hobbes is not at all likely to have presented his patron with an image which he did not approve. So he approved that image. Now, it's in 2 parts. There's a strong entablature, and written across the entablature is the word religio, religion. So you really have to attune yourself to the visual punning, which is so crucial to all of this. All human life is lived under religio. Religion is above human life. And what you see is actually a very conventional judgment. It's taken, I've discovered from, I wish I'd put this in, but there's a very famous Dürer woodcut of the Last Judgement, which is replicated here. It's a conventional representation of the Last Judgement with Christ in majesty and the separation of the sheep from the goats. And so you see angels, Christ of course coming with his angels as foretold in the Bible, who are going up into the Imperium, and then the damned are being sent down into a fiery and smoky pit. So all human life is shown under religion, which will issue in a Last Judgement. And notice below, the conventions of humanist frontispieces are very strongly maintained. There are two sides to the question. And so there are two opposing figures. They stand opposed to each other, but of course they are supporters of the title. And one is marked Imperium, and one is marked Libertas. So those are the two sides to the question. Under religion, there are two ways you can live your life. You can live a life of liberty, or you can submit to power. All right, what happens if you submit to power? Well, you get justice. And there she is, holding aloft the sword of justice, Vius Gladii, in her left hand, but in the right hand is not penal justice, but distributive justice. So this is a figure from whom power yields justice. And if power yields justice, what are the results? The result you see in the background: peace and plenty. These two people are resting from their labours with a flagon of wine. It's all bathed in sunlight. They're peacefully harvesting the fields, and in the background is a city. Notice it is without walls. No fortifications are needed. Everything is peaceful and prosperous. What if you choose Libertas? Oh dear. Right, well, if you chose Imperium, of course you get protection because the Imperium has the sword, but here you're going to have to protect yourself. And so this luckless figure has a bow and arrow with which she is going to have to protect herself. Of course, it's a woman, but just because in the Latin language abstract nouns are feminine, and so Libertas is feminine, so she's shown as a woman. Notice that she is uncivilized. Compare her with Imperium, who is in classical garb, civilized dress. But here you are in a kind of uncivilized state of semi-undress, and there's an absolutely anguished expression. Serene expression on the face of Imperium, absolutely anguished frown on the face of justice. Now, I can't tell you how weird this looked at the time. Of course, there's a huge iconography of freedom in the Renaissance. But this is how freedom it should look. Libertas. She should be in classical garb, and she should have a scepter, because freedom is what should rule. And she should have the pileus, which is, of course, the cap of freedom, and she should have a cat, because cats like to be free. You know, herding cats, you can't herd cats. So, here we are again. Sorry, I didn't give the second one. There's a beautiful one which I ought to have added. I've got a lot of pictures for you anyway, but that's the sort of thing you would expect to see when you're given an iconography of freedom. Nothing like this. So that's so strange. No book that has shown freedom has ever shown it like that. I mean, I can find no example remotely like this. So what's the provenance of this? Well, the clue lies in the text of De Cive, when Hobbes says, the native peoples of America live in this form of natural liberty at this present time. He is drawing on a visual tradition of representing Native Americans. Here is the Iconologia of Ripa, 1611. There is, as it says, America. Notice she's also portrayed in semi-undress. She also has a bow and arrow. But the main source is this. This is Theodore de Brie's engraving for a book by Thomas Harriot on Virginia, 1590. And Thomas Harriot had described an Algonquin chief, and here is de Brie's image of him. In fact, as you see, what he has done is engraved two pictures of him, same person, seen from front and back, and he settled them into a fanciful landscape in which some figures with bows and arrows are hunting a stag. Now, what Hobbes has done is to take that image. So there in the background are again the hunters, but they're not hunting a stag, they're hunting a fellow human being. And in case they miss, there's someone here standing with a club ready to kill them. In the background, it's even more sinister, because whereas in the background of de Brie there's a woodland into which the stag is going, Here, there is a clearing in which, if you can see, there is human sacrifice. There's a people standing by a trestle on which a human limb is displayed. So, the humanist idea is that this, represents an introduction to the book. We can go right back to here and say, well, what does Hobbes want you to understand? Well, you think that the great value is liberty, and that is a horrible mistake. The great value is the abandonment of liberty. Two sides to the question. Abandon the right-hand side in favour of the left. If you don't abandon it, you get war, destruction, cannibalism, defensive palisades instead of the city on the hill. Yield away your freedom in order to submit to imperium, and you get peace with justice. And of course that is the principal theme of the De Cive, added to the claim that all of this takes place under freedom. And if you know the book well, you'll know that it's divided into three parts. The first is called Libertas, the second is called Imperium, and the third is called Religio. So it organises the whole book for you. Well, there's Hobbes's De Cive. After he publishes it, as you see, Paris 1642, it's actually not published, it's just printed, 50 copies, for all of which are corrected in Hobbes' hand for circulation. So it's one of the rare books. If you find it on Amazon, snap it up. There are probably only I think 13 copies known to exist. This is the British Library copy. All right, Hobbes turns away from all of this after 1642, and throughout the 1640s, when he's in exile in Paris, he devotes himself to writing his physics, his treatise on physics, De Corpore, which is eventually published in 1655. But he tells us in his autobiography that in 1649 he just had to stop work because he learnt in Paris early in the year that Charles I had been executed after being accused of treason by his own subjects, which, of course, if you followed what I was saying yesterday for Hobbes, is a contradiction. He's an authorised representative, so his acts are actually the acts of his subjects, so they've executed the king for actions of which they're responsible. So for Hobbes, this is a nonsense, it's also morally horrible, and he said, I had to stop work and write a book on politics. Now, the book, of course, is Leviathan, published in 1651. Notice that means he wrote it in 18 months, which is quite a remarkable feat, 700 pages of some of the best English prose ever written. But in Leviathan, he comes round to the view that although it's a work of science, of course, he hasn't given up that idea, he says at the end, science is small power, but rhetoric is power. And so he wishes to add rhetoric to his reasoning. That does a lot to explain the literary style of Leviathan, which is so very different from the De Cive. It's a very funny book, as you know. It's full of jokes about the clergy and about idiots who disagree with him. But much more important for me is visual eloquence, that Hobbes still thinks in Renaissance terms. We need a summary of the work at the beginning, which will show you what you're going to read. And of course, it is a very famous frontispiece which ensues. And there it is. Well, first question again is, how can we be sure that Hobbes approved of this visual summary? We're really in luck because of this. This is the manuscript of Leviathan. There's one surviving manuscript of Leviathan. It's in the British Library. And it was a presentation copy made by Hobbes to the young prince who he'd been teaching mathematics in exile in Paris. This is the future Charles II. Hobbes gives him a marvellous manuscript of the book on vellum in October 1650. And this is its frontispiece. Now, he gives this to his future king. So he must approve of it. But of course, then the point is the same, that with one remarkable exception, it is the same design as was published. The remarkable exception is that we just see faces looking out at us instead of faces looking up at the Colossus. Here they look away from us, and of course visual pun, again, very important. We look up to him. We're looking up to him. We'll have to identify who this Colossus is. But they don't look up to him in the drawing. They look out at us. But Kinchhoster has very elegantly noted in General History of Ideas recently that they're looking up to the king, because this is the presentation copy. It's only intended to be seen by the king, and they're looking up at the king because he's looking down at them.
No scripture, though.
No, that's true. We'll come to that. So the crucial point is that the drawing, it's a drawing on, it's a pen drawing on vellum, and this, the copper engraving, are basically the same figure. Now, I don't really think this has been fully understood. There's been some brilliant writing done on it, including by a member of the present audience. But I want to try something a little bit different here, which is to relate this to the visual tradition that I've talked about this evening. Now, I first want to consider this relationship to the de cive, Leviathan back to de cive. There are astonishing changes about what he wants you to think is central to his political philosophy. And the most obvious is the one that you're looking at. He had said, all human life is lived under religion. It's gone. It's completely gone. Furthermore, there's a lot of visual punning going on here. Notice that everything was under religion, so that religion is over human life. We now read at the top, non est percasus super terra. There is no power over the earth that can be compared to him. But this is not a religious figure. This is someone with a human face. So nothing is above him. His face goes right up into the clouds. So there's this amazing change, which of course reflects the fact that in the 9 years between the two books, Hobbes had spent a lot of time reading biblical criticism, and he says in Leviathan, I now see that there is no scriptural warrant whatever for the idea of hell. Hell is just a metaphor. The whole discussion of hellfire, he thinks, is just a string of metaphors. No sensible person would believe that there's anything resembling hell. So that's all got to go. But also he says, there's nothing in scriptures about how they went up and sat with God. And he says, anyway, God's a monarch. He wouldn't go up and sit with the monarch. He's very indignant, he says in the Bible. They might sit by his footstool, but they're not going to join him. So all of that's got to go. Nothing of that remains, because Hobbes has simply changed his mind about the relation of religion to civil life. And that's what we are left with. No power is above the power of the Colossus. Now, this Colossus has all power, because there are two forms of power. Obviously, there's the civil power and ecclesiastical power. The symbol of ecclesiastical power is the crozier, which is the bishop's crozier, and he holds that in his left hand. The symbol of penal power is the sword of justice, the jus gladii, and he holds that in his right hand. So he has all spiritual and all temporal power. Notice that nothing comes from above, everything comes from below. The people here make up the body politic. But if the people begin to desert the body politic, notice another deep pun, they arm the body politic. They are its arms. So if they drift off, he can't hold the sword. All power comes from below. It all comes from the consent of the people, who are in this artificially way congregated together into a body politic with a head. The same idea in imperium here is imperium, of course. He possesses imperium because he has, as we saw in the de cive, the sword, and the sword is the sword of imperium. Now, if we remember the de cive, we saw two sides to the question, didn't we? Very traditional humanist understanding. Life is a choice. You can choose to live in natural liberty, you can choose to give it up and live subject to power. All gone. The choice has been made. This is, you might say, a later moment in Hobbes' narrative. There's just one dominating figure, and this dominating figure has all imperium. Well, there's what I want to say about the relationship between the two texts. He now wants you to focus on completely different issues in his political philosophy. He wants you to think not that there are alternatives, that's all sorted out, this is all you can get, but he does want you to think about the idea of a body politic with a head, and he does want you to think about that being the source of all power. Power coming from below, no power coming from above. Nothing is above him. Now, I now want to say a word. I promise I won't speak for more than the hour, but we started at 1:15. Am I all right, friends? Is this okay? Yeah. I now want to say something about the relationship of this not just to Hobbes's early work, but to the tradition of the comely frontispiece. What do we expect from the comely frontispiece? Well, we expect to see guardians of the title, supporting pillars, columns, all that classical stuff. Remember, here are these columns, pillars of strength. Here are people in Hobbes standing by these classical columns. We're expecting to, and they're standing by the title as well. Here they are again, standing by the title, standing on classical pedestals. All gone. We also expect to be welcomed into the book. The idea of, as we saw, they are liminal spaces. They're upholding the title, but the perspective draws you into the book. Here is a kind of welcoming perspective as well. You're going to learn about Ovid. All gone. What's happening here is you're just being eyeballed. There's this completely dominating figure. There's no sense of a receptivity. In a way, you might think he's actually barring you moving behind. Well, let's now look finally at the Colossus that we're looking at here. His unchallengeably complete power, and there is nothing over the earth that is to be compared with him, is associated with two consequences. And one is peace and prosperity. There is a very orderly city here, and it's got a citadel, and there are armed men protecting it. Everyone else goes around at peace. There is a countryside which is symbolically bathed in light. Notice that none of the villages are fortified. The sea behind has merchant vessels. The river is busy with trade, peace and prosperity. There's a further visual effect here which you can see if you look at the cathedral. Cathedrals always orientate west-east, don't they? So this is the east, so the power comes out of the north. But great power always comes out of the north. That's simply a kind of trope of the Renaissance. Now, at the same time, there's another extremely important visual pun going on here, which is, if there's going to be this symbolically light countryside bathed in sunlight, with power coming out of the north in order to offer protection and indeed almost an enfolding, as Campbell said, various things are going to have to be kept under. And residually, you do see columns. They're under the city then, but there are columns. Here's one column, and here's another column, and they do stand by the title. So in a way, there is a reference to the tradition, but it's an extremely satirical reference, because what you're looking at is the forces that must be kept under if there's going to be this peaceful and prosperous side. So what are these forces? There are two columns, and you're encouraged to read them across and down. And if you read them across, you see a castle with a cannon firing from its ramparts, and you see a church. Underneath, you see a marquis's coronet, a symbol of the nobility who live in these sorts of castles. Under here, you see a bishop's mitre, so this may actually be a cathedral. Now, things are beginning to get nasty. Underneath the castle and the coronet, so we're talking about over-mighty subjects here, is a large cannon, which is pointed directly against the Commonwealth ecclesiastical and civil. It's going to blow it up. On this side, you see another extremely dangerous set of arrows. This is a fulmen. This is a conventional representation of a thunderbolt. But of course, the thunderbolt is the thunderbolt of excommunication. And that will also blow up the Commonwealth ecclesiastical. It's going to be blown up by excommunication. Now, how is all that going to happen? Well, the overmighty subjects in their castles with their cannons can assemble these very sharp and pointed weapons. You see muskets, you see pikes, you see swords, and you see a drum to call the seditious to arms. But here also, you won't be able to see this, but these are no less sharp and pointed and nasty weapons. And this one says syllogism. We're getting scholasticism. Scholasticism is very dangerous. This says real and intentional. I mean, Hobbes has a lot of fun in Leviathan with all this scholastic jargon about real objects and intentional objects, which are the objects of our thought. This says direct and indirect. The Pope did not claim direct power over temporalities, but he did claim indirect power. That's to say he could depose princes. So it's getting worse and worse. And what is the final outcome? Notice the final pun, the lower depths to which the Commonwealth could sink. Well, this simply leads to civil war. And here you see cavalry colliding and pikemen about to engage in mass slaughter. But what does this lead to? Well, this leads to a conclave of the Roman Catholic Church. These people are in Libertas, which marks them out as just the sort of people who would think, I know what, we are going to have indirect power, so we can excommunicate, so that drops from his hand. Just as here, that sword has dropped from his hand because there's no sovereign. In the Civil War, there are two sovereigns, ex hypothesized. So these are the forces that must be kept under. Notice they are under. But in another very alarming piece of symbolism, they are inextinguishable. They are under the foundations of the city. They're always there. And so they're always likely to destabilize the city. If you took all this away, the city collapses. And of course, that is the point of the book. Well, if you ask how these twin sources, these are the columns not of supporters, but of the great enemies of the Commonwealth, the two great enemies, overmighty subjects and the Church, are the great enemies of a peaceful Commonwealth. The answer is that someone is going to have to surmount them, going to be above them completely, and to have all power. And so there he is. So this is a summary of Leviathan, and what does it say? It says, we must submit all our combined powers to a single and overwhelming authority, which will be ecclesiastical as well as civil, and which will keep under the rival powers of the overmighty subject and the Church. And of course those powers are what in chapter 29, the chapter on the dissolution and death of commonwealths, are singled out by Hobbes as the enemies. So only one puzzle remains for me, and that is, what is the identity of this Colossus? Well, those of you who were kind enough to come to hear me yesterday evening already know the answer to that question. The head is the head of a man. It could be the head of a woman, but he's got large moustaches. It's definitely a man. But it is the head of state, that's to say the sovereign. But he is a sovereign representative. And whom does the sovereign represent? The sovereign represents the state. What is the state? The state is the artificial unity of a multitude who have covenanted to establish a sovereign representative. And you see them. They're looking up to him, and they are all civil society. If I could show you this in enormous blow-up, you would see that some are men and some are women, some are children, some are adults, some are kneeling in reverence. No one has taken their hat off, though. This is not God. This is a mortal God. You don't have to take your hat off, but you do have to show, as Hobbes says, all. And some are actually kneeling. Some are soldiers, some are civilians. The whole of civil society is there, and they're all looking up to the head of state. So this is the first attempt ever, and I suppose therefore it's justifiably famous, to offer a representation of the concept of the state. The state has to have a sovereign, but the sovereign is simply the head of state. The state is the body politic, and that's what you see. Furthermore, he must, or she, the sovereign, as a representative, hold all power. So the name of that union, and this brings me back to what I tried to say yesterday and rounds off what I've been wanting to say in these two lectures. The name is Leviathan, and Leviathan is the name of the state. Thank you very much.